As an educator and as the father of 2 daughters, I worry a lot about the world that we are leaving our young people. It is a world deeply damaged by our reliance on fossil fuels. And the question is, how do we move forward from here?
I can't imagine a future for my daughter where she doesn't have access or opportunities to connect with the land the same way I did because of climate change.
I realize that if I want my daughters to be able to have the choice to live in South Florida 30, 40, 50 years from now, we're going to have to take action.
When I served as mayor of New Orleans, I witnessed the impact of climate change directly. It came with the increasing intensity of hurricanes and floods.
When I see the climate crisis, I see it putting so much pressure and weight on people's ability to just exist as they are.
We know that the impact on the environment has a real significant impact on children's ability to learn.
This is the moment where we have to make a decisive commitment to create the cleaner future that can stave off the worst impacts of climate change.
Inequity is the challenge of our lifetime, and the only way that we're going to overcome these inequities in our society is through the future leaders that we have in schools.
I am very concerned about climate change, and I recognize that schools offer us a huge opportunity.
The education establishment is a very large industry, and there's a lot that can be done.
In the places I'm from, quality climate education could make such a difference in people's lives, and I would really love to make that happen in my lifetime.
Public schools can prepare and have to prepare our kids for the high-wage, high-skilled jobs in a new clean economy.
Our students are our future. The leaders of tomorrow are being educated in our classrooms today. Why would we not want them involved in the climate dialogue right now?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today to discuss how we can mobilize the education sector to take climate action. I'm Laura Schifter. I'm a senior fellow at the Aspen Institute, leading the K12 Climate Action initiative. And I'm thrilled to be here with 4 amazing education leaders. We have former U.S. Education Secretary John King for the Obama administration right here. Pedro Rivera, president of Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. Merrit Jones, Senior Advisor with Student Voice, and Megan Bang, Professor of Learning Sciences at Northwestern University and a Senior Vice President at the Spencer Foundation. Now, we're here today right after some news that came out yesterday, and I think this news continues to happen over and over again, and as a society, we have not yet fully listened to it, but I want to emphasize some of the news that came out of the UN yesterday. Another IPCC report came out, and the UN Secretary General called this report a file of shame, cataloging empty pledges that put us firmly on track toward an unlivable world. Now, what he also said is that for the societal transformation to actually occur, we need to create a worldwide grassroots movement that no one can ignore. And key to that worldwide grassroots movement is going to be education. And so I'm thrilled to be able to talk about how we can mobilize the sector for action. Climate change is a personal issue for many. I know I experienced my own climate moment reading a UN report several years ago and looking at my kids and realizing this is not tomorrow's problem, this is today's problem, and we have to do everything that we can. So I'd like to start off by just asking each of you to also reflect on what personally drives you to engage in this work. And I'd love to start with Merrit and then Megan, and then we'll shift over to Pedro and Secretary King.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and when I read this, the description about how many children are missing school because of extreme weather, I thought back and I said, wow, from a quick count, I missed over 3 weeks of school during high school for hurricane-related weather, for tornadoes, for a whole slew of things between my sophomore year to my first year of college. And so, just thinking about that, I grew up in a coastal region of South Carolina and in South Carolina, and I've watched my entire life in 24 years just how much our climate has changed our coastal regions. And I'm going home to South Carolina to teach this fall, and I will be in Charleston, where climate change is visible every single day. And I'll be thinking about that and making sure my students understand that impact and how to live with it and do something about it.
Buju, as a Ojibwe woman and as the mother of Ojibwe and Navajo children, as the auntie and grandma of other Indigenous children, the land and the waters is who we are as people, and the state of our lands and waters tells us that we haven't been good relatives. And so for me, this is about continuing to teach next generations about what the right way is to live on this earth and how to be good people.
First, this conversation started as a father of a teenage boy, and as he was learning about some of this content in climate action, climate change at school, I remember probably half jokingly, because he loves to rib me, it's like, all right, look at what you guys did to our environment, to our world. And then later, having been a state chief in Pennsylvania before this role, we used to engage with the community. We would do a Chiefs in the Community cabinet and community events, and in one of those events, I was partnering with the Department of Environmental Protection. And I remember, usually when you're the education secretary anywhere, you're the focal point of the whole event. But in this case, Patrick, he was the focal point. And I remember looking over at him as he was giving updates, and folks were asking questions like, you're very depressing, just as he was giving updates around, everything that was going on at DEP and the state of the state. And so this is when I really started getting actively engaged and involved and becoming a better learner in this space, and realized that now's the time we have to act, not only for our children, but for our economy and our world.
For me, it's very similar to Pedro, the experience of being a father and having my daughters hold me accountable, right? Because we were having a conversation about how the climate discussion unfolds and how frequently adults will say to kids, like, we're so glad you're going to solve this problem in the future. And my daughters were like, no, you guys need to solve this problem. Like, we need to start solving it now, and this can't just be something that you pass on to us. And I appreciated them calling me and all of us out on that. And, I think this commission work is really about saying, how can our education sector really take ownership for our role in solving this challenge?
So Secretary King, picking up there, you co-chaired the K12 Climate Action Commission with former Governor and EPA Administrator Christine Todd Whitman. Can you share with us a little bit more about the work of the commission?
Yeah. So it's been an amazing experience. We have a commission made up of former elected officials, state education leaders, local education leaders, educators, including a classroom teacher, environmental activists, civil rights leaders, the heads of both teachers' unions, and then youth activists who are doing this work every day in communities. And it's made for a very powerful conversation. We also have philanthropy at the table, which has been very helpful. I think, the commission's initial charge was, let's gather information about what's happening out there. And that was actually very hopeful. And, we'll get more into that, but hearing about what folks are doing in communities and states all across the country gave us a lot of hope and a lot of questions about how do we scale those things so it's not just pockets of excellence, but actually change across the board in the sector. And we really focus on four main areas. Certainly infrastructure and the carbon footprint of the sector. It's 100,000 school buildings, 480,000 school buses, 2 million acres of land, 7 billion meals a year. That's a lot of impact that one could have if you move towards renewable energy. A second area of focus was around resilience and the role that schools can play in making communities more resilient, particularly as we face climate disasters. A third area of focus for us was on education. How do we help students understand the climate science, and also how do we prepare young people for careers in green jobs and a renewable energy future? And the fourth area of focus was on issues of equity, because as always, Climate change and environmental injustice disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color, and so we can't have this conversation as a country without centering issues of equity. And it was a fabulous experience, and that culminated then with the creation of a report really calling for action at every level, federal, state, and local.
Great. And, as Secretary King mentioned, the commission spent a year learning from people on the ground. I'd love to ask Pedro and then Megan and then Secretary King, what was a big takeaway from what you learned about the work going on across the country?
How actively engaged and involved our students were. I pride myself in trying to become a student in the areas that I engage and really read, but being able to sit and hear from students, and not only how deeply they've actively researched and really engaged on this topic, but their advocacy. I mean, they were fierce and understood exactly what the ramifications were if they weren't fierce. And so they were inspiring. And I think I walked away every time we had a presentation geographically diverse from our students. I was ashamed, as an adult sometimes, in hearing from them, but also inspired at the same time. And, they really drove me to want to do better.
Yeah, I would add, one of the things that was most hopeful to me was to hear from ed leaders who don't need to be convinced that the sector should be leading. They were doing it despite bad infrastructure, frankly. So we heard from educational leaders who had strategized about how to get electric buses and were really methodical about moving forward on those sorts of things. Or educators who were worried about kind of the contentious nature of potentially teaching about climate change, but actually when they located it in local issues, in kind of things like air quality or water quality that come along with it, that educators were really engaged and motivated and saw their young learners being able to really take it up. And I think a little bit about Jen Lebrett from the Spokane tribe, thinking about how fires are routine in their community, and the school is the hub where people come to survive those fires. So I also think as we think about community adaptation, these ed leaders were already there, where disrupted schooling because of climate change impacts was their reality, and they were planning for it now.
Yeah, at the risk of sharing a very sobering story, one of the most searing accounts we heard during the listening tour was from a school board member in Santa Barbara who described running for school board on a climate platform and getting on the school board and folks not listening. She was the one at the meeting raising her hand saying, we should get electric buses. Wait, we're renovating that building. Why aren't we putting solar panels on? And folks weren't that interested, and she wasn't moving the agenda. And then there were droughts, and then there were fires, and then there were mudslides, and there was loss of life and tremendous damage, and a highway that was blocked for a long period of time, and then people got into action. And so now Santa Barbara has a comprehensive climate action plan, and there's real leadership to move towards renewable energy and to make schools hubs of resilience, but after the disaster, not before. And that really stuck with me because we could all be her, right? Our risk as a country and as a world is that we just keep putting off taking real action, and then it's the disaster that finally spurs us to take action after there's already been so much damage.
So, Merrit, I'd like to turn to you. The commission really put forth recommendations in thinking about comprehensive action for schools, like we've talked about, thinking about the physical infrastructure, the teaching and learning, the needs to build resilience, and thinking about this all through a lens of equity. And importantly, students are going to be a big driver of this work. What do you think educators need to do to include students in this work, and how can it be done in a meaningful way?
Yeah, it's so much more than educators, because it is really about co-creating with young people. We know young people have been leading on climate, and we also know, and importantly to name, it's definitely many more young people we see in our TVs, Greta Thunberg and so many other activists, but there's so many young people I know at my home of South Carolina who are from different diverse backgrounds and geographies all across the country, young, Black, Indigenous, Hispanic leaders who are leading today. They're not waiting for adults to take action, and we know that they can't do that alone. When I'm in schools talking to young people over the last 5 and 6 years I've been at Student Voice, when you ask students to talk about their school experience, the first thing they'll tell you is how much they hate school lunch. And the second thing they'll often talk about is how detrimental the mental health crisis is in our schools. And solutions to those two issues can't be separated from climate and climate issues. School lunch isn't great because it's highly processed and no longer locally sourced. There's such a far cry from when my great-grandmother managed her local elementary school cafeteria and grew things in the garden of the school and served every day. And so we know that to address those issues and to really change experiences for young people in schools, we have to be thinking about climate and infrastructure and what it looks like to make our schools safer, more livable, more breathable, our buses, and that we know that eco-anxiety for young people is going to require having real and meaningful conversations tied to action that can allow young people to feel hopeful so that they don't have to go to school just thinking about the world that they're inheriting that has not been stewarded well by the adults and people who've given it to them. But there's so much educators and districts can do, but it really has to be co-created with young people. And so there's so many willing and able and excited young people to jump in. It's really about inviting them to the table, not just to rubber stamp a plan, but to build it with them.
And Megan, continuing this message, Indigenous communities and communities of color disproportionately feel the negative impacts of climate change, and yet Black and Latino communities on average are more concerned about climate change, and Indigenous communities are leading the fight on climate change. But we continue to hear about the fact that sustainable schools are things that are nice to have. How can we flip this narrative so that we can lead climate action with equity?
Yeah, I think at the core that we have to really understand some of the root causes of both why we are in the climate crisis that we are and how it has intersected with the core roots of social inequality at the same time. And in my mind, once we really dig into both of how are human beings living on the earth, what has our relationship been to how we organize our communities, these things become really obvious. Indigenous communities are, 80% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous territories. 40% of the forests are in indigenous territories. And one of the deeper problems here is that when we start to look at climate impacts and the ways they impact things like health equity, educational equity, where things are, we see that communities of color, poor, rural, and urban communities are the ones directly impacted. And if we don't think about climate equity and its ramifications of climate change, and I think sometimes when we talk about climate change, we don't do the work of saying, we mean more fires, we mean things like drought, we mean things like air quality. All of those things are intertwined, and it creates unlivable lives or lives that are continually stressed by both social inequality and our systems of inequality and our ecological inequalities that are continuing to build. And I think one of the things that is really important, particularly in a US context, is the US's relationship with Indigenous communities has to shift. There is a reason that people do not understand Indigenous peoples typically lead. I think there's real promise in kind of getting to a social justice paradigm within climate action, because I think most people in the climate sector understand that Indigenous communities are in the lead, and that the more you're engaged in climate change, you start to understand that these issues have been central to Black and brown communities for decades. It started out as environmental justice, and really those environmental justice issues are because of climate change. So I think that we have this real opportunity to actually have communities of color leading this social and ecological shift that we desperately need in a way that, frankly, without it, I'm worried about what will happen. We will continue to have this response to harm that I think John was talking about if we don't listen to communities of color who have been talking about the harm for decades.
Yeah, and I think, in addition to the social transition that's needed to really tackle climate change, there's also going to be an economic transition. And the economic transition is going to mean new jobs, and there'll be jobs afforded to certain communities. And so leading that economic transition with the thought of equity is going to be essential in that. And I'd love to ask you, Pedro, especially with where you sit, How do you think our education sectors, both K-12 and higher education, need to be thinking about the economic transition that's going to happen now? And how are we preparing communities and all communities for that transition?
So I think there's a great opportunity. I think, as an educator, I'm always thinking, how do you make connections, especially around those who don't want to have the conversation around, climate change and climate action? And I think workforce is absolutely an opportunity. When we think about the next generation workforce, we know that every year, around 47,000 jobs are created, around the green economy. And when you think about the starting salaries in those areas, anywhere between $40,000 and $90,000. So when you think about just the workforce opportunities and the workforce demands, there are jobs, and there are opportunities to educate our kids, our students, to teach them a skill that's going to be a lifelong skill in this development and allow them to earn a life-thriving wage. At the same time, when you think about just how science and technology is evolving, jobs in these areas are ripe through that evolution. And not only for those that are going through our K-12 system and in higher ed, but also for individuals who are looking to upskill. Individuals that are looking, to find, new, gainful employment. Individuals that want to transition into fields that may not be as intensive, in their bodies and with their immune systems and the like. And so I think, where we can have positive conversations is around the economy, around the workforce. And just the next generation workforce standards, which the green economy and addressing some of these issues are just ripe and there to have.
So on some of those points too, and thinking about this, the Vice President just announced yesterday some effort that they're doing to really think about supporting schools in building new infrastructure and integrating that. She released an action plan for building better school infrastructure. And components of that are really thinking about supporting schools and making investments in clean energy. And in particular, they're talking about opening up the American Rescue Plan to help schools invest in infrastructure. Why is this a critical moment right now to make sure that school leaders out there think with a climate mindset, especially in light of these investments? And Secretary King, and then open it up to any of the rest of you too.
Yeah, look, this is an existential crisis and requires immediate action. And we have now some resources that people can deploy. And either we will deploy them in ways that ignore the threat, or we can deploy them in smart ways that respond to the threat. So there's an opportunity to use American Rescue Plan dollars to move schools towards renewable energy. There's an opportunity to use bipartisan infrastructure dollars for electric buses. There's $5 billion that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that could be leveraged for electric buses. There's an opportunity as folks invest those American Rescue Plan dollars in changes to heating and ventilation systems to think about how do we do that in a way that reduces our reliance on fossil fuels. Are there opportunities to leverage geothermal, right? And those conversations have to happen now as those dollars are coming down so that people can thoughtfully invest those resources. And hopefully then that drives a conversation about state capital funds. And when those new state dollars come and we're going to do a renovation and building anyway, what's the opportunity to move that building to net zero? Or when we have local dollars that we're going to use to make that update to our bus fleet that is necessary, here's an opportunity to replace those buses with electric buses, lower energy costs long term. But if folks don't start those conversations, if they wait and think of this as a 50 years from now problem, we'll have missed a huge opportunity with leveraging those federal dollars right now.
Megan, I'm going to put you on the spot too, since I thought you talked about this so well. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I remain really hopeful that we might repeat the history of past pandemics in the world where people think about what world do we want to build. And that this is a potential moment with a potential set of resources where leaders could think about a long-term ethical vision about what's possible. And I think that these dollars coming in can be thought about in a short term, or they can think about like, what is the trajectory that we are building towards that is not just recovery, frankly, but recognizing what were the deep issues that we had before the pandemic, that the opportunity to act boldly, to think boldly about our potential futures is moving. And I think that requires an ethic and a kind of courage for leaders right now to have that big vision. And if responding to climate is not part of that vision, I think that we're gonna really say, wow, there was a failure of imagination in this moment and with this investment. And I guess the last thing I'll just say, as we build, as leaders are sharing this story, I actually think that the way that that's communicated to their publics, to the people they're engaged with, actually could help build a kind of grassroots climate movement to understand that all of our little decisions actually lead up to what we need to do. How you replace your HVAC systems, what you decide to put in what places, rather than sort of only looking to the huge solutions. Schools could be the center of communal change in a way that I think we've been struggling to figure out a vision for a while.
And I really appreciate you talking about courage, because one of the things that did come out with all the news stories yesterday was actually the leaders in the UN saying, we need political courage on this issue right now. It's time to move past the narrative of individual action. We need systemic action and we need political courage. And yet we still hear a lot of people saying, we can't talk about climate change in schools because it's too political. So I'd love to ask, especially Secretary King and Pedro, with your roles in political positions, what do you think we can do to overcome this conversation of climate change being too political to talk about right now in schools? And how do we push through that to actually meet the moment that we're facing?
Well, one, I think the public is actually ahead of politicians on this, that the public has a deeper understanding that climate change is an urgent threat. So I live in Maryland, spending a lot of time these days traveling around Maryland, talking to folks. And one of the things that is clear is we've got flooding in many parts of the state that is attributable to climate change. We've got farmers, even in rather conservative parts of the state, who are losing farmland to saltwater intrusion. So they know this is a problem. And we have now the opportunity to say, and here are some concrete actions that our school systems can take to tackle this problem. Kids know it's a problem. You know, kids increasingly have climate anxiety. They're looking at this world and saying, what are you leaving us? And we're actually saying, here's a way you can get organized inside of your school to put pressure on your school board to take real action. So part of how we overcome, I think, the political hesitance is mobilizing that grassroots energy, in just the way that Megan was describing, to move the politicians to where they need to be. The other observation I would make is, and we heard this from one of the teachers who talked with us during the listening sessions, you have to have the conversation about our immediate surrounding community. She talked about overcoming some of the political resistance to talking about climate by talking about the land. And the land is something that people care about regardless of partisanship, and talking about the land in their community and the impact that climate change could have and what could be done to prevent that. And so if you ground the conversation in the stuff that is right around us, I think that helps move past some of the hyper-partisanship of the cable news discourse.
I agree 100%. And much like Secretary King, I'm an urban educator. I've been in urban environments, all my career. And I think there's a practical opportunity right now. Right now we have an opportunity to invest. And when you think of, the history of education, especially our history in education, think of the number of times, I can't even count the number of times we've had to close school down because it was too warm, it's too hot in our classrooms, or it was too cold in our classrooms. Or the infrastructure failed. And we think about just the pandemic, that we're dealing with now. How many times were we not able to bring students back to school because of poor ventilation systems, or not having a space in which they could be, they can distance and learn. So when we think about historically, especially in our most vulnerable communities, the lost instructional time and lost instructional opportunities that exist because of poor infrastructure, we now have this space where there's an investment that we can piggyback off of to create a foundation that will not only address what we're discussing today around climate action, climate change, but create an environment where we can educate our children without free of interruption. We can create an environment that's much more optimal for them to learn. We can engage our communities in new ways. And so we just move away from, the political, conversations, which I understand well, I know firsthand, can be volatile, and just think practically around this. We can use this as an opportunity in this space to create an environment where all of our kids can learn, regardless of if they're in an urban environment, a rural environment, suburban, and, start to really address this issue of equity as well.
And Merrit, I'd love to pull you in on this too. How do you think about responding to the political questions, and especially with what you alluded to about growing up with other young people in South Carolina, and how do you think that students think about this as whether climate change is too political or not?
Yeah, I think bottom line is that they don't. One of my best friends in South Carolina is the head of Teenage Republicans, and we've spent tons of time together talking about climate. He works for and helps lead advocacy efforts for a conservative climate group that really emphasizes the importance of protecting natural resources. And so it is a bipartisan issue. I think so much of it is in messaging, so much as everything in our political system is in messaging, and that is certainly, we're not immune to it in the K-12 space, particularly in this moment. And I think it really is just about what does happen at the local level, and what young people can do, what teachers, what school administrators can do in the school building. I think, in our programs at Student Voice, every year we teach and train young people to see their schools and districts and communities as sites of action. And every year we have young people who choose to work on climate projects because it's right in their face. It's something they see every day. It's something they care about. And in those ways, seeing it as community servicing, as community projects and community-based, and rooting in a local context, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a decision maker who's going to tell a young person, no, that's not an important thing to talk about, or not something I want to address. And so I think a lot of it is just about, showing the action piece of it, and making sure that people really understand what's at stake and what's actually happening in school buildings. Because I think it's so much of always what happens at schools. I think there's never, decision makers aren't in school buildings, so they should just go to school buildings, see, and I think schools can also do a better job of inviting communities in to see the really incredible project-based things. I do a lot of work with National Geographic, where they're really starting to lead on, how do you bring together education and climate? And I have so many other National Geographic Young Explorer friends who are doing the most incredible research all around the world and all across the US. And I think highlighting more of those stories about seeing schools as places to do that work is really what we need to do to hopefully convince folks that this is not too political of an issue to talk about in school.
So talking about seeing that work going on in school, I think, Megan, I'd love for you to tackle this question because, educators still don't see climate change as their work. They don't see it as necessarily impacting their work. Maybe in local communities, pockets will see it, but the sector has not yet mobilized to see it. And a lot of people in the climate fight don't see the role that education can play in accelerating climate action. Can you speak to how we kind of do this cross-sector work?
Well, I think we have to think about what are we asking? What is the challenge of human beings in the 21st century? And learning how to live together differently on the earth and with each other, I would argue, is the evolutionary challenge of our species. Education and the ways that we raise children, what we teach them to think about, how they learn to make decisions, how they learn to relate to our lands and waters, are central to raising next generations. And if we don't change how we're doing that, the challenges of ongoing unsustainable decision-making and leadership will persist for decades to come. And so for me, there's this question, while we both need folks that are moving outside of education to do things, if we really have this time to reimagine, what is education for? What kind of society are we growing? And education is a place where those fundamental questions drive what we do.
Yeah. And I'd like to ask, so we talked a little bit about the challenges, and I just want to highlight just a couple additional points here and do a little lightning round of questions for you too. So in 2019, a Washington Post poll found that 57% of teenagers say climate change makes them feel afraid, but only 14% said that they learned about how to reduce the effects of climate change in school. Now, we have a long way to go to narrow that gap, but I'd like to ask each of you to say what you think the biggest opportunity is to scale action. So we'll just go down the line this way, starting with Secretary King.
Well, look, as we've talked about, people have resources in this moment that they could deploy here. I think every school district should be creating a local action plan. What are we going to do on climate? And that means what are we going to do in terms of infrastructure? What are we going to do in terms of educating kids around climate science? What are we going to do to prepare young people for the green jobs of the future? How are we going to make sure that if power goes out in our community, people can come here and charge their phones so they can get in touch with their loved ones, right? Thinking through every aspect of the role K12 can play in climate. And if every local community did that, we'd have a good start towards the kind of world we need to build.
I agree 100%, and would add this conversation is happening all around us. You watch the when you watch television at night, when you're everything that you're reading now around media and social media, engaging in this conversation. We're being immersed in this narrative, and just piggybacking off of what Secretary King shared. We have the resources to have these conversations available to us, and I just think we need to piggyback off of them and use them and engage authentically with our students.
And I think I'd echo the earlier point in the conversation. I think American Rescue Plan dollars and ESSER dollars give us an unprecedented opportunity to invest. And my challenge to that would be include young people in those conversations. I've been supporting young people all across the country to start figuring out how to engage in those conversations, and they're I think eager and excited too, but you have to do that engagement well.
Going last in this lineup is never a good place, by the way.
You'll get to go first in the next one.
I think we have the opportunity to make climate relevant to everything, that it's not a separated issue, that we should weave it through everything. It's not just teach kids climate science, it's weave it into social studies, into history, into mathematics, into every aspect of learning. And for me, the climate anxiety that is very real is partly because the issues are ginormous, and if one person feels like they're not making enough of a contribution, it's how we get societal angst within an action. So to me, the opportunity is for us to make it relevant to every single thing we do rather than a separate issue.
And I think on that, just the last thing I'd like to end on, we started on kind of a sobering note of the reality of the crisis that we're facing, but it's really important to lead with hope. And so I'd love to just ask you all to reflect quickly on what gives you hope in this moment. And Megan, we'll start with you and go this way.
Indigenous communities' resilience. Indigenous communities have lived through the kinds of ecological and social change over the last 500 years because of colonization that human communities need to live through again. And that our communities are still as robust, as beautiful as they are, means that I know we have the human capacity to do what we need to do.
Young people, as always, and the opportunity to go into a classroom and talk about climate change in the context of social studies this fall.
Our kids are holding us accountable, and there are really good paying jobs in this area.
We focus a lot, I think, on the things that divide us. That is our sort of dominant conversation in this moment. But on this commission, we had Democrats and Republicans. We had educators at every level, administrators, teachers. We had activists at the local level and folks who were having the high-level think tank policy discussions. And everybody was together trying to figure out, what can we do? What can we do, each of us, in our own space? And the moment that crystallized it was visiting a net zero school in Arlington, where they built that school for the same per square foot cost as a school that is dependent on fossil fuels. And the kids in that school all understand why the school is net zero, how it works, and they are going home saying, hey, we have solar panels on our school. How come we don't have those on our house? Hey, we got here on an electric school bus. How come we're moving to an electric car. And so that's the transformation we need.
So we're going to thank you all in 1 second, but one call to those folks that are here. I'd love to have you all talk about this issue more in your community and figure out a way that you can lead, because ultimately we do need to build that grassroots movement, and it's going to start with all of us talking about it and taking action. And I am so thankful to be able to work with these amazing education leaders on this work and encourage you all to act in your community as well. So help me say thank you.